So yes, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Bjorn, for agreeing to present. We're going to hear from Bjorn for about 20 minutes, and then we are going to split into breakout groups to either discuss the paper that we sent out kind of late last night that Bjorn suggested, or just his presentation or anything related to the field that he's studying. So you can go ahead and take it away, Bjorn.
Yeah, I just need to figure out what's the right way. I simply have to ask you what screen are you watching? No, you're watching the.
Yeah, we have presenter view right now.
Yeah, exactly. So I need to switch.
Which displays?
Yeah, I will. So I'll just start over again. It's usually the opposite. Now, for some reason, the screen 2 is screen 1 and vice versa. So I want to share this one here, actually. This is what I want to share. Now it should be better.
Perfect.
Looks
Yeah,
good.
I see a thumbs up. So yeah, well, as Tessa said, the idea is that I go presenting for about roughly 20 minutes, and then we have time for each other. Of course, I think it's easiest. So any kind of questions or comments or ideas that was kind of came up to you while I was presenting, please note them or remember them, and then there's a chance for us to have an interesting discussion afterwards. And for all of those that I haven't met before, my name is Björn Wickenberg. I am currently splitting my time between doing research at Lund University, at IIIE, an institute with a long name, abbreviated into IIIE, and also doing time in the city of Malmö within urban planning. So that was what I used to do before I started doing my research, which I currently finished. So this June I defended also and presented my thesis, and this presentation is then having the same title as my thesis: Translation and Implementation of Nature-Based Solutions in Cities: Experimentation, Learning, and Knowledge Production. And I'm really happy to be able to present, and Hade, it was nice to have you here, because I don't know if you were, no, I never broadcasted online from my thesis defense, so that's good. And so basically the idea is that I will share with you the work I did during my PhD, pretty mainstream type of presenting. So I will do like this, that I will first talk about the framework of my research, and then I will go into just briefly present the different papers that builds up towards the thesis, and then some of the conclusions I made in it. All right, so unless there are any questions before I start, I simply continue. Yes, so just moving that way here. So if there's anything I want you to take away from today, it's the following key messages. First, implementing and governing nature-based solutions requires reflexive governance and cross-boundary interaction among stakeholders, including planners, experts, developers, researchers, and local communities. Second, for this, it is important to foster inclusive communication and build trust. This warrants increased focus on relational and emotional capacities amongst planners and researchers. Third, learning is, I believe, key for change and requires supportive institutional structures and resources to be able to safeguard the continuity and evaluation of implementing nature-based solutions. And lastly, transdisciplinary and collaborative platforms for experimentation, which include, again, both research and practice, have potential to stimulate further learning and knowledge, and thus contribute towards transformative capacity to advance nature-based urban transformations and ultimately, more broadly, sustainability in cities. And as I said, this is the kind of outline for today's presentations. So after an introduction, a quick overview of the research, very brief about the methodology, some key findings and conclusions. As you all are aware of, it's within the kind of context of a changing climate and cities being increasingly affected by extreme weather events, causing flooding and extreme heat waves, resulting in fatalities and huge societal costs. And if we think about gray infrastructure as highly engineered systems for water management, but also an increasing share of concrete elements and impermeable surfaces in cities, these infrastructures have shown to be insufficient for handling the effects of climate change. And this is underlined in a recent report of the IPCC stating that climate change impacts and risks are becoming increasingly complex and more difficult to manage, resulting in compounding overall risk and risks cascading across sectors and across regions. And in order to mitigate and adapt to climate change, we need a transformation in how we plan, design, implement, maintain, and govern land use and the built environment. Now, currently, as also you're aware of in this context, in this network, there are high hopes on nature-based solutions, or NBS, to solve some of these challenges. And NBS have been defined as solutions inspired and supported by nature, which are cost-effective and also simultaneously providing a lot of co-benefits, environmental, social, economic benefits, as well as helping building resilience and equitable or just cities, as we talk of. And as you can see, a very promising concept, at least in theory. Now, what I think is interesting is to what degree might this fall true? And I think it's too early to say either boo or yay. We simply have a lot to learn about the concept, but also the implementation of the concept. So what it means in reality for us and for our cities. Well, furthermore, we also know the NBS concept as an umbrella policy concept, currently promoted by policy institutions and research and innovation agendas, both in the US, I guess, but also very much so in Europe and in other parts of the world. And if we were to depict what NBS are in simple terms, it's basically green and blue infrastructure, such as trees, green roofs, urban parks, open stormwater systems, and so on, which are deliberately implemented to complement gray infrastructure, either to hold and slow water or to cool temperatures down, but also providing other benefits, such as storing carbon. And also adding on here, as you know, from the side of NBS having a potential to help cities address mitigation and adaptation challenges, then also it falls within the framework of many of the SDGs. But I think that goal number 11 on sustainable cities and communities, at least for me, makes a lot of sense to mention in this context. So although NBS being experimented with on a global scale, they're still far from mainstream in policy, planning, and governance. There are various gaps that hamper their scaling, for example, cognitive, governance-related or finance-related barriers. And another point for me, being an urban planner, it's very important to also bear in mind that urban space is extremely scarce in cities now. It's very costly, vested in interests, and highly politicized, and thus subject to many different conflicting planning goals. So it is a concept or approach that is fighting amongst a number of objectives that need to be reached in the city. Well, all of this combined here impede the adoption and use of NBS at the scales that would need today. And for scaling up NBS, research has identified a number of knowledge gaps. In my thesis, I point towards gaps around mainstreaming of NBS, action-oriented or lack of action-oriented knowledge, and as well in-depth understanding of processes related to NBS implementation. And more broadly, these gaps relate to challenges around translating and implementing not only the NBS concept, but sustainability concepts in general. Now, my research sits within the broader field of urban sustainability studies and urban transformations research, and the view that solving sustainability challenges requires systemic change. This, in turn, requires translation and implementation of sustainability, which involves both research and practice. And here, in my research, practice refers to urban planning and development, where implementation and governance are closely interlinked and refer to complex cyclic processes of collective steering and taking action, involving multiple stakeholders at multiple levels. And in my thesis, I argue that NBS implementation, at least in the Swedish context, often occurs at the intersection between experimentation and formal planning. And this is interesting, I think, because this creates a lot of tensions, but also a lot of potential learning and knowledge for transformative change. So what you see here on the screen is the framework, kind of simple framework based on 3 layers. The first layer represents a broader context of governing nature-based urban transformation. It's the green frame here. And the second layer represents the cyclic and iterative process of translating and implementing NBS, here visualized as the spiral in the middle. And the third layer represents the strategic activities that are part of and influence the translation and of NBS, and which are investigated in my thesis. And these are experimentation, learning, and knowledge production. And as you know, there are many more aspects which matters to realize NBS in local context. These are the ones that I focused on. So I thus see translation as situated at the boundaries between research and practice, and involving various translation activities within and between these two. Now, 5 papers contributed towards my thesis. The first paper studies the interpretation and use of the NBS concept in science. Paper 2 investigates different frameworks for NBS implementation. Oh, no, I just heard someone. No? Well, paper 3 explores different strategies to overcome barriers to adoption and implementation of NBS in practice. Paper 4 investigates transformative learning for NBS implementation. And then finally, paper 5, which is not yet published, hopefully sometime. Paper 5 reflects on research practice collaboration for implementing NBS. So the objective of my thesis was to study in what way processes of experimentation, learning, and knowledge production enable and/or constrain the translation and implementation of NBS. And for this, I'm asking 3 research, or was asking 3 research questions. 1, how does research engage with the NBS concept, and how is implementation addressed? The second question revolves around how can experimentation enable collaborative processes of NBS implementation and learning? And finally, how can research and practice engage in co-production of knowledge on NBS, and what are the associated challenges and opportunities of that? As for methodology, just briefly here, I have used qualitative methods for data collection, for example, interviews, workshops, field visits, and as well for analysis, I use qualitative methods such as content analysis, applied participatory analysis, and so on. In my research, I take an inter and transdisciplinary research approach, in the sense that the research to varying degrees always involved not only researchers, but also people with other than academic backgrounds, which could be defined as practitioners within the field of urban development. And this approach was influenced mainly by 2 aspects. First, I have my own background is in urban planning. Although I'm not a trained urban planner, I'm an environmental scientist, but I just happened to find myself one day in Malmö and working with planning. The second aspect influencing this transdisciplinary approach are the 3 projects underpinning my research. And I know Hade, I don't know if there's anyone else that I saw here, but at least Hade, you were involved in the Naturation project, a Horizon-funded project, now finished, but still living, I think, in a sense. But also 2 other Swedish research projects. And what these 3 projects built on to various extents was then the inclusion of other than academic stakeholders. And they all shared an interest in how NBS can enable urban transformations towards sustainability. So, taking a sip of coffee, I will now turn into the papers, and just briefly telling a bit about each and one of them. So the background to paper 1 well, paper 1, it's a bit sloppy to say paper 1, but this is how it is in a thesis. So I kept it here. Paper 1, the background to that paper is that various green concepts have emerged in the last decades to operationalize the idea of sustainable development and to describe and communicate the interdependence between nature and society. And from the perspective that policy and science influence the framing and operationalization of green concepts, this paper reviewed 112 publications using the NBS term. And the aim was also to analyze, how science interprets, frames, and uses the NBS concept. And here we leaned on the concept of boundary objects and applied different categories, namely the use, core ideas, and granularities of NBS in the analysis to explore the either disintegrating or integrating powers of the NBS concept, according to how it was used in the articles that we looked at. And we found that NBS, as I said before, it's an emerging concept represented by a multitude of various solutions. So kind of in a creative phase, we could say, and still subject to definitional efforts on the boundaries between scientific disciplines, as well as within science or between science and policy. Now, looking at these papers that we studied, empirical studies are or were most common, and papers predominantly focused on environmental benefits. Now we know that the concept has aspirations to look at that not only environmental benefits, but also economic and social benefits of NBS. But this is not, or was not at least, so much considered in studies. Neither did a lot of studies involve stakeholders, which is another kind of key characteristic of the NBS concept. So overall, we find a low level of integrating the NBS concept and its core principles. But on the same time, we see a broad uptake across different fields, which indicates that the concept is relatively easy to grasp and operationalize for science. And those are two ingredients that normally characterize boundary objects. And really far from rocket science, in the paper, we suggest 3 future pathways, and reflecting on where we might go in the future with this concept. Either the concept becomes broader and deeper, meaning that the concept develops into an own concept with practical, real impact. Or we see another pathway, which is the concept becomes biased and towards, the concept will get minor impact on its own, but perhaps will still stick to other older related concepts, such as ecosystem services and so on. Or it simply becomes a buzzword with no impact and most likely replaced by another concept in let's say, 10 years time. We've seen it before. Though I have to say I'm positive. I'm really hoping that we won't see that happening with the NBS. I think it's far too interesting as a concept or approach. So I certainly hope that the buzzword theory is far from true. Now, over to the second paper, which departs from the view that scientific frameworks are part of steering discourses and knowledge production in society, which also guides the understanding and the actual implementation of NBS. And here the aim was to understand how frameworks for NBS address implementation specifically, and also the second part of the aim was to synthesize and present key elements and conditions required for enabling the implementation process. And this review is a review paper. It was based on 36 publications, including any framework for NBS. And in general, we found that there are very few frameworks addressing implementation. Most frameworks, at least a few years ago, commonly addressed either design or strategic planning. So 2/3 of all of these papers presenting any framework were actually talking about planning, strategic planning, or design. And less so focusing on implementation, and even less so focusing on maintenance of nature-based solutions. And then through doing an in-depth analysis of 7 out of these papers that explicitly addressed implementation, we identified collaboration and co-creation of knowledge as 2 key elements of the implementation process, which enable shared problem understanding, actionable knowledge, and informed decision-making. And we argue that the integration of the concept should be situated in relation to cycles of urban planning or policy. Sometimes we talk about it in the same way. And this to get a better understanding of the scales of integration and to move beyond conceptual understanding towards operational understanding. So moving towards implementation-focused understanding of NBS. And we also suggest that more close consideration to the collaboration process is relevant for ensuring cross-boundary understanding of how NBS can be applied to create these multiple benefits that we wanted to create. And such considerations are A, decisive for the type of knowledge included in the process, and B, therefore better addresses issues of power imbalances, inclusion, and democracy, which is relevant for a broader acceptance and a broader rollout of NBS. Now, the first two papers where I kind of focused on what is happening on the research side, which is quite common to do when you're a PhD student. You want to do your literature reviews, understanding the field. But then I was kind of eager to move on to the other side, practice, my other leg. In paper 3, we were doing that. And we argued that improved understanding of how NBS are integrated into urban planning and governance is needed. And the aim of the paper is to assess, or was to assess, the role of governance strategies to overcome barriers for NBS integration. And we did that in 5 different municipalities here where I live in Skåne, in the south of Sweden. And as for methods, we used a applied participatory analysis in the context of a transdisciplinary learning lab based on these municipalities' own needs and desires for increased knowledge exchange. So the research questions were developed by the cities themselves, for example. And the researchers in the project were perhaps could be seen as facilitators and process owners in a way. In the lab, we took a collaborative approach thus, and we analyzed one development project in each municipality from idea to implementation and maintenance and follow-up to understand and get a better view of how NBS have been integrated and the barriers encountered in everyday planning practices. So a very straightforward, very simple method to explore and understand better. Now, the results revealed 5 main strategies used by municipal staff to tap into existing potentials and to overcome barriers to NBS in daily planning practices. And all these strategies, what they have in common is that they engage other stakeholders, essentially through networking and the pooling of resources. And in large, these strategies worked because, again, in the Swedish context, with a very strict municipal planning monopoly, individual planners have relatively large freedom to take action and be creative, we could call it. Well, in addition, 3 cross-cutting themes emerged from the results, and these relate to first, the role of individual champions as change agents. Number 2, the increasing focus on relational approaches to better address NBS integration. And 3, as a consequence, the need to support the development of cognitive emotional capacities in order to foster trust, inclusive communication, and getting a situation where you learn together, social learning. Paper number 4. This is a paper where we argue that research has not sufficiently addressed the role and potential of these social learning processes, specifically how transformative learning can spur radical shifts. So here we had the aim to investigate how transformative learning was enabled and or constrained in processes of NBS implementation. And for this, we studied 2 cases. The first case was the Eco City Augustenborg, and the second project was the Biodiverse City project. Both of these projects were undertaken in Malmö, in Sweden. And by analyzing institutional arrangements, visionary ideas and strategies, and stakeholder participation, we highlight that the combination of interaction, committed people and organizations, and place are important keys for transformative learning. Change agents and leaders are indeed essential for fostering learning within the frame of innovative experiments, but for broader learning, an active learning community is also needed. And based on these cases, we were then able to identify specific enablers and constraints, which we framed as seeds of transformative learning. Yeah, you might wonder, like, why only seeds? Well, because being critical about the success of these projects, you could argue, or we do argue, that they, in many aspects, they were successful, but in terms of learning, and especially in terms of transformative learning, which is, let's say, the ultimate goal for learning for transformations, we were still a bit critical of their success. There are still things to learn. And drawing on these so-called seeds of learning and on literature, we summarize key enabling factors for transformative learning. And these can be seen here in the figure on the right-hand side. So again, things I've mentioned before, but interactive and reflexive governance, action-oriented knowledge production, cross-boundary collaboration, as well as citizen involvement. These are kind of key factors. But for such learning, for this type of learning to take place, it is necessary to have a number of supportive institutional structures in place to ensure that evaluation and continuity and resources for relational capacities are in place as well. So we conclude that in Malmö, the experimentation in these two large projects did provide valuable learning. However, did not lead to real shifts in the planning and governance structure or context. So there is room for improvement. Now, just quickly about my last paper, not, as I said, not published yet. Here, my aim was to reflect on a case of research practice collaboration and learn from that. And it's not an original research article. It's let's see, what practice review, which intends to follow processes in practice, either as a researcher or as a planner. And since I feel kept somewhere in the middle between these two, I thought that, well, this is something I should do. So it's a paper where I reflect about the process of working with NBS. And what do I analyze in the paper? Well, Had and me were in a project called NATURA, where one of the kind of key foundations of the projects were local innovation partnerships, abbreviated as URIPs, urban regional innovation partnerships, I think. And these included different stakeholders, planners, researchers, and from public and private organizations. So I thought that I was part myself of this platform partnership, and thus had a good opportunity to reflect about those 4 years where I participated there. And I was really much, I was inspired by a study by, NATURA et al. And I took the position of the kind of the researcher which is embedded in the process while making observations from within. And here in this paper, I identify 4 main fields of action, key steps, so to say, in the research practice collaboration process, which sought to understand how we integrate and implement NBS. Each of these action fields could then be related to different opportunities and challenges. For example, challenges relating to the creation of trust and ensuring inclusiveness. And in this paper, I conclude that soft skills are vital, especially for reflection purposes, and that there is an increasing need for new competence for more efficient capacity building. And to bring research and practice closer, I suggest the following. First, building relations through trust, interaction, and flexibility requires relational capacities and communicative skills. Second, learning is, as I've said before, a central component for co-producing transformative knowledge, which requires reflection throughout the whole collaboration process. Learning and continuous reflection should therefore, or could therefore, be seen as a process within the process, and perhaps also more explicitly addressed as such. And third, specific skills and methods for facilitating and managing co-production of knowledge are required and should be considered an area of expertise in itself and not just simply taken for granted. So the urban planner in me, looking at colleagues who are experts in different fields, it's not easy for them to take, on top of being experts, take on the role as knowledge brokers or facilitators in transdisciplinary projects. All right. So following the structure of the framework I used in the thesis, and based on the findings in the papers, I present 3 key enabling governance strategies for translating and implementing NBS. First, experimentation is important because it enables change at a more comprehensible scale. However, I suggest that research and practice should focus more on both formal planning and experimentation, because both constitute important pathways for integrating nature in cities, but also to make better use of the learning opportunities that these 2 pathways present. These experimentation processes have to be interactive and collaborative to ensure strategic pooling of resources, stakeholders, and their knowledge. Second, learning, or perhaps more importantly, relearning, is needed if we're to see and do things differently, which could happen in processes of transformative learning. This requires, for example, deliberate and collective reflection as part of urban planning and governance, which is always not the case, as we saw from our case studies. Typically, within urban planning, you don't have time for reflection, because after one project is finished, you move on to next one. So I think it's a relevant question or concern to raise. And third, experimentation and learning are closely related to knowledge production and the need to combine different types of knowledge, cognitive, normative, and practical knowledge, to gain these cross-boundary insights. And here, co-production of knowledge can play an important role for generating actionable knowledge for NBS. And ultimately, when applied, these strategies combined contribute towards building capacity for change and for governing nature-based urban transformations. And no, I had 3 more points. And to summarize, these were the main conclusions of my thesis. So it's not only 3, if I remember right, it's 6 bullet points. So beginning with number 1, the boundary quality of the NBS approach, which I argue it has, fosters transdisciplinarity, collaborative experimentation, transformative learning, and co-production of knowledge. If we play the cards right, that is. NBS is therefore more than just a concept. It is actually, or has the potential to be, a smart strategy and approach to revitalize the discourse and praxis around sustainable urban development, which we could perhaps argue has fallen into sleep a bit. What is sustainable development? The third point here, transformative learning is a key component of change and driver of knowledge production, and should therefore be acknowledged as a catalyst for urban transformations. The three last points refers to reflexive governance, as well as relational approaches are important to generate transformative learning and actionable knowledge. And building capacity for nature-based urban transformations requires the combination of various types of knowledge, which I mentioned before. And here, transdisciplinary approaches can help, but requires communicative skills and relational capacities for facilitating and managing processes of collaborative learning and knowledge production. So with that said, I want to say thank you for listening. And now I think I'm going to turn to Tessa to see where did we end up finally. I think I remember what we ended up with.
Yes, thank you so much, Björn. We are now ready to move into breakout rooms, and then we'll be in there for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have 7 minutes for some very short reports back, as well as if people have questions for Björn, they can ask them at that time as well. So I'm going to move us into about 3 breakout rooms. All right, so you're going to be assigned automatically. I'll be in this main room, so just come back if you have any problems. Oh, and I also didn't mention this. If you had the chance to read the paper that Björn suggested, it was sent out in an email. You can discuss that now in the breakout rooms. We have a guiding question as well. And here's the link to that. And then if you didn't get the chance to read it, we have another guiding question for you. That is, what are the barriers or challenges to implementation in NBS in your region? And I'll also put this in the chat. So let me just open up the breakout rooms, and then I can add them all into the chat after that. And hi, does anyone in this room need help figuring out how to get into their breakout rooms? And if not, you're welcome to just hang out in here if you don't want to participate in the breakout groups.
in Scotland. Yeah, we also mentioned Scotland, which has done quite a lot in terms of developing the sort of public involvement, stakeholder consultation processes. So we can learn quite a bit from the different countries.
Thank you, Ian. Chris or Loan, maybe you want to speak for your group?
Yeah, we had a good conversation as well. A number of folks brought up the sort of challenge of thinking about nature-based solutions as just an add-on as opposed to being the primary focus of an infrastructure project, and also the challenges of the perception of maintenance and management. So some people might think of NBS as an extra burden, or as nature being separate as opposed to being interconnected with the city. And so just kind of the challenges regionally of how that plays out. So we're talking a little bit in Asia as opposed to in Brazil and North America.
Great, thank you. And then I'm not quite sure who is in the last group, if somebody just wants to speak up.
Yeah, I can try to give a little bit of a summary. We were, I think, from various continents as well, and some specific regional barriers came up that were actually not so specific. They were shared across regions, but particularly different regulatory frameworks to deal with the fact that NBS are still mostly adopted as demonstration projects. That's sort of the way to get municipalities enthusiastic or involved. Financial barriers often being used as a sort of excuse, like to not go forward or not go to scale. Lack of patience also came up, and a sort of more engineering mindset or risk averseness, if you will, when it comes to implementing something a little bit less, less certain in terms of how it develops. Please contribute, because I'm not sure I have the whole conversation now, but.
I think you summarized very well.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I think you summarized it really well. And the only piece that I would say is, the scaling really requires kind of additional municipality, state, and federal support all lining up or aligning, and that doesn't always happen.
Thank you, everyone. So now we have just a minute left to ask any questions that you may have to Björn about his presentation or anything else.
Could I just say to Björn, I thought he was absolutely spot on with what he said. I was looking into similar issues with my own research here in Germany, and also referring to Scotland. And I think that, yeah, I couldn't really have put it better myself. It seems to have picked up all the key issues and the barriers and the needs for translating the sort of science and policy into action. So it was really interesting, really positive.
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually, so I'm a generalist. So those who would expect like specific details, they would never get them from me. But I had an interesting experience, just like a last comment here, that being a generalist also means that there will be some people in the research debate that are kind of disappointed because they're perhaps more specialized in their areas. And I said to Tessa that, well, we could discuss this other article, because it's the first time that I kind of experience a reaction where other researchers are actually constructively critical. So not just being angry with you and just saying you're totally wrong, but so, which is interesting, because one of the aims with my research was to just make people aware, and researchers, that we need to be more, focusing more on implementation and the local processes to be able to get somewhere, basically scaling and mainstreaming and so on. And the interesting thing today, again, I read another paper which has kind of responded to this lack of implementation focus. And I'm only happy that they're like critical to because what they say, well, you're addressing this implementation gap, but you're not saying how, you're not giving guidelines. And I think that's perfect. That was my aim to, with my, let's say, entrance into research, to have researchers discuss more closely to implementation and dealing less with overarching general discussions, which are really difficult to translate into action. So I'm slightly optimistic and hopeful that research is actually a good thing now.
I just wanted to say one other thing, if we have time, just to build on what you said, Björn. My experience has been, the more you get specific and detail oriented, the more the solution might be customized for a given context. And so there's a very fine line between, where you can kind of take a systems level approach and sort of outline things in the way you did it, because that kind of approach is applicable. But as soon as you kind of get to the next level of, how people can actually implement that, it really depends on the context that you're working in.
Yeah, just a comment. I think you're totally right, and that's what now, if I would do some research, I would be interested in looking at more at the skills and capacities side of it. So what are the, because these skills and capacities are perhaps more universal in a sense. So yeah, I think that's interesting to learn more about. If we're to change our cities, we need, I'm pretty sure we need new ways of thinking, new not only new tools. I'm talking about like capacities as people, how we can learn or relearn to think about how to build and develop cities. So these capacities, transformative capacities, that's, I hope to be able to explore more.
And it looks like we are about 4 minutes past time, so I don't want to keep anyone any longer. But thank you so much, Björn. This was a great presentation, and I think it was a really awesome opportunity for people attending this webinar to talk to each other, which hopefully we'll be doing more of. Yeah, if you haven't filled out this poll, just do so real quick. It'll really help us in figuring out how to prepare future webinars to be, as collaborative and interactive as possible. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.